going to like this cigar. It goes with the hat.
That's the way.
This is my micro shamanism. I blow smoke on the computer before each Zoom talk.
1920s.
Yeah, that's right. See? Okay. So, we're going to talk about traumatic weirdness, which is like, on the one hand, how weird trauma is and the therapies that deal with trauma, but on the other hand, how traumatic weirdness itself might be.
Which seems like a relevant point, given that in the moment we're living in a mass collective, sort of some kind of a version of a trauma experiment of extreme weirdness. So,
yeah, if that's what's going on, like, then there's going to be a lot of people who shut down or have weird trauma responses, and then a small, like, esoteric nucleus of people who are able to treat it as something they're either already able to handle or something they can handle with anti-trauma techniques of various kinds.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, it's really the ability for one to stay regulated. I mean, for me, trauma processes are all variations on a thought of how to stay coherent and how to stay contained and regulated no matter what one is going through. And a simple definition of trauma could simply be any set of experiences that take us out beyond a place of the ability to regulate and modulate and stay coherent in any environment or any context. And certainly the entire kind of global economy getting shut down and fears of this kind of invisible enemy that could get everybody and all this kind of stuff is going to obviously heighten and radically overwhelm a lot of people.
My sense of trauma, or like my crass definition of trauma, is usually just anything that's too much or too soon.
For
and
sure.
I always go to, like, the grotesque example of people having sex with little kids. Right? Like, that would be bad. That would be traumatic, even if it was not harmful and totally consensual. Why would that still be traumatic? Because it's too soon. The system is not set up for it, and therefore it's going to introduce a wobble or a shadow or something that's going to interfere with it down the line.
Yeah, and chronic states of high degrees of stress even can constitute. So it doesn't have to be kind of singular events like, most of us think like a car crash or whatever, some abuse, some terrible scenario of physical or verbal or sexual or abuse. It can just be like seeing the bank account number really dwindling and are we going to be okay in the next couple of months, or just any kind of that,
or chronic low level stress. But then also maybe this other kind of trauma, which is something that just doesn't fit into your categories of experience at all.
Right, like the whole world shutting down to spontaneous kind of spiritual experience type things. Bad trips. You got lights in the sky, anomalous encounters, dreams that turn out to come real, really odd or haunting kind of experiences of deja vu or feelings of going to certain places, for instance, where there's been, maybe one doesn't know this, but you go into a house or a place and you just get that something icky has gone on here. You don't know what, but that feeling of the hairs start standing on the back of the neck, and it's just ooh, I gotta get out of here. Then you find out later, somebody was murdered in that house or some terrible thing, right? It's oh yeah, well, how did I know that? How did I know that? I don't know, but something's in the field, and the person's energy is kind of ooh, this is rather sinister feeling, and I'm not feeling safe. So, oh man, and even kinds of experiences, if we say too fast, too soon, or too intense, even so-called positive type numinous or high strange encounters can actually lead people into freeze states. They can get too overwhelmed by the awe or majesty or beauty or whatever's there, and it can too create certain kinds of frozenness. I mean, normally people think of like abductions or like bad, whatever, bad trips or negative, painful encounters, but it doesn't have to be necessarily obviously negative to be dysregulating.
That's a really interesting thing, because a lot of people, like you say, they would dismiss their positive experiences as non-traumatic because they're positive. Right? So, and also because there's something in a lot of us that doesn't want to think of ourselves as traumatized. It's very convenient to limit trauma to a small handful of people who had an obviously terrible thing happen to them. It's just not happening to me, and the rest of us, we're in the normal zone.
I didn't fight in a war, or whatever.
Exactly.
I'm not a soldier. Yeah, exactly. Or firefighter or something. Yeah, I mean, and trauma comes with a lot of, I think you're pointing to there is important cultural criticism and a lot of shaming, as opposed to, from a nervous system point of view, it's simply a kind of factual or objective description of an overloaded system. It's not a personal attack on a person being weak or not, can't cut it or whatever. It's just a fact of life, actually. Of course, there's gradations. I mean, there's people who've had more intense and much more of it. I don't want to minimize the difference, but everybody, you're right, everybody's somewhere along a spectrum. And trauma is simply a part of existence. The difference is whether we know how to heal and recover in response to it or not, basically.
Okay, so what's the normal range of responses to moderate trauma, the normal range of responses to extreme trauma, and then what do we do about those things?
Well, the normal, I would say the cultural norm, for speaking here in a kind of whatever, this globalist society or whatever we're calling it, the normal range of experience is just degrees of dissociation, truthfully, which is various kind of attempts to just neutralize the surface symptom expressions, but it leaves the underlying dysregulation still in place, which will then tend over time to show itself in pretty brutal stuff: health crises, psychological deterioration, really painful emotional experience, breakdown of relationships or challenges to stay connected, loss of a sense of purpose or meaning. So trauma physiology, the classic term is fight, flight, and freeze. People probably have heard that. And fight and flight are the initial responses. So that would be, for most people's experience, fight is like rage, and flight is like anxiety, fear, panic, terror. And that's kind of the first level of response. And if that's not able to be worked with at that level, then the system goes to its most archaic response, which is freeze. So it's actually fight or flight, then freeze. There's a kind of gap there. And freeze is like a possum playing dead. It's just curled up in a ball, covers over the head. I just don't want to deal with the world. I just want it all to go away. It's just like a really deep collapsing kind of experience. And most people would know that as depression. So then there's a whole industry, of course, that tries to push a bunch of pills on people to make their anxiety go away, which is the flight energy, or to make their depression go away, which is the freeze or the collapse. But again, that tends to, more often than not, be kind of try to get rid of the surface visceral feel of that versus how to actually unlock freeze when a person has actually gone into freeze. That's not something you can just do with a little pill, or Netflix or whatever, meditating, you'll meditate it away. So there's a lot of spiritual bypass problems and all these various. Yeah, which is its own version. Yeah, exactly. So in a freeze case, the person actually has to go into the freeze safely, slowly, and then locate somewhere in there the fight and or flight energy is still trapped. That's where the life force is. So if a person has a bunch of rage because they've been, say, abused, but they were taught that they're supposed to be loving and nice to everybody and blah, 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 then that volcano that maybe wants to explode implodes, and then that leads to a freeze or a collapse. So they would need to be able to find and be able to give voice to their rage. That's where their ability to come back to life is, and like come out of a frozen state and like thaw out and come back into warmth.
Okay. So under the ice, there's fire. You got to get back in touch with it. And
or electricity, if it's free, if it's more flight energy. Yeah.
There's not just a reactive disturbance. There's a counter-reactive suppression of that disturbance. You've got to get back in touch with that and own it. And it seems to make sense completely in extreme conditions. Yeah. But what about the danger in more moderate conditions, or maybe even extreme conditions, of getting stuck there, of practicing that reactivity, right? There's a classic argument in psychology whether you're going to own and discharge the trapped energy, or whether what you're really doing is cultivating that mentality by going into it.
It's a great question. And that's kind of where the art of, like in trauma work, they would talk about the first step actually being what's called resourcing. So the first step is actually to start to connect to parts of ourselves that actually already feel whole or full or agile.
Right.
And for some people, it can be very difficult to even locate some smidgen of that experience, just so we can start to have some healthy differentiation between a part of us that's already at ease versus parts that are under-resourced or are fractured. Because a lot of times trauma can swallow up people over time, and they kind of feel like they're this big and it's this big, monster or whatever that's going to eat them up. So to build up resource so that our sense of ourself is bigger, and in comparison, this kind of energy that needs attention relatively or comparatively feels doable, is really the first step. And that can sometimes take a
establishing the either the alchemical container in which it's going to happen, or you're taking like an Ariadne's thread of mindfulness and health, however small that might be, into the maze with you.
Totally.
Now that sounds like something which occurs individually, but could also occur interpersonally, right? Like, because interpersonally you might get into some really unsettling conversation with someone, but if the context of that is you really love and trust each other and you're willing to go on that journey, then it can be very liberating rather than practicing having a shitty relationship.
For sure.
Do you think there's interpersonal trauma in the same sense that there's personal trauma?
Oh yeah, for sure. And we could even, you can take that to, you can sort of take that on any level we'd want to. Family systems replicate trauma through generations, communities, even certain landscapes, groups of people, larger kind of collective identities. I could even probably argue that like institutions or systems can themselves express either more generative, resilient kind of energy as a kind of a cultural matrix or kind of vibe, or they can express traumatized, expressions. And when the like the whole thing about our trauma physiology, or our survival instincts, maybe is a better term, is that they are good. You know, there is a value to them in the sense of like, we have survived. So you don't want to just be like, oh, walking around and, you know, especially if we're talking like, you know, archaic human interaction with the, you know, vital forces of existence. So it's good that we have survival instincts. The thing is that they're supposed to be very short-term emergency measures under duress. And then as soon as the threat is over, they're meant to turn off. So for example, Peter Levine, who's the guy who came up with somatic experiencing, studied animals in the wild and how they respond to trauma. So like, you know, classic examples like a mouse or something is like a hawk or an owl's going to try to eat it, and it just manages to scurry away and barely escape, like some nature documentary where they're all playing in a field and the nice music's playing and then a dark cloud comes on, like, dur, dur, dur. And so the thing escapes. It can't just lay there for 3 days like curled up in a ball weeping. It's going to get picked off by something else. Like they shake, they tremble for a few minutes, they just shake it off, and then they bounce back. And the problem for most humans is we've forgotten how to do the shaking off and the bouncing back. So as to your earlier question, you know, about are we just going into the experience and just kind of like scratching an itch, or are we actually like resolving the underlying issue? First, there's the need for resourcing. And then the other aspects that are typically described are things called pendulation and titration. Pendulation is the ability to stay in the wholeness space resource, and then just do like, just kind of go over to the edge a little bit of where some of the challenges. Again, whether we're talking individually or we're talking like in a couple, like where that, it's learning about just being on the edge of that place where we're not tipping over, but willing to just tip a toe in there. And titration is kind of the same idea. Like another word for that would be sort of like digestion, like small, doable, bite-sized chunks. And it's a real experiential somatic thing to learn the art of being able to like resource, go do a little bit of work, step out of it, reground, see the trees, look at the sky, go back and do a little more, just bite-sized. And it's really this kind of very methodical, slowed down rhythm. And that's what allows the human body to actually process and digest these kind of experiences.
This sounds like what some people would call tantra, insofar as there's an embodied somatic feeling awareness and a voluntary willingness to encounter disturbing sensations at their edges in order to integrate and transmute them. However, the thing that really stood out to me about it was, like Levine, I've heard him say you got to do the physical release before other kinds of therapy are going to work for you. Now, do you think traumas are differently encoded at different levels? Like, is there an intellectual trauma? Is there a physical trauma? Things like that? Or does every trauma have some tentacle in every one of the levels so that you have to unpack all of them in a big complex?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think it can depend on the situation. I would say that if we were using kind of like an integral model, this is where I think maybe an integral frame can be helpful to us, because even though it kind of talks about various levels of experience or consciousness or whatever identity, there's always a physical correlation. So if we're talking like high strange trauma, I think that's probably encoded originally in some other state, dimension, whatever, plane, whatever, order of being. But it's going to show up in the nervous system the same way. And therefore it can be dealt with in the same way, at least on that level, at least at a most base level of re-regulating ourselves kind of in terms of our energy. So like the example of, the abduction phenomenon, people often have the experiencers or abductees, we want to call them that, have like often suppressed rage, right? Which is really, could be worked with and is really not all that different than a person who had some kind of an experience of what would be abuse from a human being. I mean, it's weirder on one level, but on another level, if we just kind of take the structural elements and distill it down, it's really not all that different. So the same processes can be used to help cultivate the rage, and then, like we talked about, and actually get through it and discharge it in either case. In the case of obviously high strangeness, that doesn't answer the question of like, what does that all mean and how do we make sense of all that, which I do think is important, but at least at a like basic level of health and well-being, it's liberating.
This makes me think of Jacques Lacan. Makes me think of the idea that of his categories, and I've argued that there's a strong parallel between his category of the real and what we might call the causal state. I won't get into that too much, but the real is, kind of inherently traumatic. It's a kernel of something that can't really be digested into the symbolic ordering of the universe that you experience. And so whether that's on a small scale, some overload or accumulated over-intensity has occurred to you in your own life, or it's something that seems like it ruptures the very fabric of what we assume reality to be. They operate very similarly in that case. But what do you do with, is the real inherently incommensurable with the symbolic order? And if you touch it, there's going to be a rupture. Or is there a way to handle it smoothly and gracefully? And if you're prepared properly, then it's just delightfully incommensurable.
Yeah, I think probably somewhere in the middle. I probably would come down somewhere in the middle. And that might just be based on my own experience. But certainly I've seen the, what I would consider kind of the inherent buoyancy, and there is a certain grace, I think. It requires work to activate it, but I've certainly seen people be able to shake off insane amounts of brutality that, like, just from a logical point of view, I would think like they shouldn't be able to work this through. And yet I have seen, I would consider that a miracle, but I'm fine with using that language. It's not a miracle like a supernatural entity came in and like had a magic wand and like poof, like and did that. But it's no less miraculous to me. So, I think the level of horror and pain always, to me, is kind of stupefying that I hear from people. But equally so is this incredible level of resilience and possibility and buoyancy and transformation. And to me, they always do this kind of like every time this one gets bigger, this one gets bigger, and they just kind of like doing like that. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but.
How about this one? Is reality itself inherently traumatic?
I think certainly aspects of incarnation are. Aurobindo's notion of the vital shock would come to my mind. Like, it's no joke being here. And to really, for me, the kind of spiritual path is the ability to hold the fullness of all of our various expressions mediated, at least over in this form. I think our physicality is really crucial and key. And there are definitely all kinds of layers of interference and all kinds of layers and conditioning that's set up to have us do the precise opposite of that. Like, from cultural conditioning to as weird and high strange as we want to get, if you want to get into some kind of like Gnostic ideas of like interference on kind of subtle levels too. So I think to like be here, to really be here, it is tantric. Like it is going to require getting comfortable with levels of really intense, ecstatic, beautiful experience, levels of really intense, highly visceral, searing experience, and then also kind of like the boring middle. Like you have to get cool with that too. And yeah, and that's to me, that's a lifelong endeavor. I don't think that's a simple, I've done that, check, what's next kind of thing.
Well, if it's a lifelong endeavor, then that's a good argument in the reality is kind of traumatic category. If you think about it, it's unbelievably peculiar. This is my impression. And if you feel it, it's more intense than you're used to. So in both those ways, you've got to go beyond some kind of ordinary limit that you're imposing on yourself in whatever state you're in. And I'm curious what you think about how intentionality operates there, right? If we see somebody who's been very overtly traumatized, we don't want to apply, any label to them that makes it their fault and makes it harder to deal. But when you look at the subtle aspects, if you look at the way you're recoiling from thoughts and ideas and experience and relationships constantly, the kind of stuff that comes up in meditation, you can really get the impression that you're almost doing it on purpose, right? You're not just having your sympathetic nervous system triggered into fight, flight, or freeze. You're sort of perversely trying to shut yourself down and pull away from the things you love the most.
Yeah. That's a great point. I think, you mentioned alchemy and tantra. So I think trauma is one side of an experience when it's on the dysregulated side. And in alchemy, we're always interested in how to turn the lead into gold, right? How to transmute. So to me, the interesting question is, what is the flip side or the transmuted form of trauma? And there is an expression that I've seen, that experienced and witnessed in others, where there is this weird, almost Hegelian thing where a different form of creativity and power and agency can come forward that somehow is tied to the nature of the trauma. This is some kind of shamanic-y type argument, I suppose. And I want to be very careful with that, because it can too easily slide over into hey, we all signed up for some pre-life contract to all get, brutalized, or, and that's the world's evil, and so what? It's because we all signed up. No, I don't want to go there, but I will say, just practically, I've seen people transform through a specific kind of trauma that then is intimately tied to the form of the medicine that they have to bring to this world. Does that mean it should have happened? Does that mean it was good that the trauma happened? I wouldn't necessarily go that far, but I would say they made good of it.
So one of the things that occurs to me when you say that is that traumatized people can experience forms of growth and adaptation as a result of that trauma, which might be impressive, even though we might not want those forms. And then they might also output those uncanny signals, like you were saying about the person in the house where the murder was committed. What I'm thinking of now is, what do psychedelics, UFOs, and the Donald Trump presidency all have in common, right? This potential to be traumatizing. But see, if Trump was overloaded at some point and developed some adaptation skills, and then he outputs a kind of traumatizing field to others, but we can still appreciate those adaptation skills he's got, and they might show us something interesting about a world that's more trauma-inducing, or at least highly strange and ultra-ambiguous.
Yeah, it's important. I think it's a really good point you're saying there. You know, I kind of often say that there's only kind of like three options. People will often talk about there's only really three options with trauma. One, kind of ingest the poison, don't put it onto anybody else, but also don't transform it yourself. And then it just kind of eats a person alive and they get some cancer or some chronic fatigue or whatever. The second option is basically expel one's own trauma and traumatize somebody else. That would be the classic example of the child who was abused by the alcoholic parent who then ends up being an abusive parent.
Does that one work?
No, okay. Neither of those options work. Those are options. Those aren't good. Okay. I'm not saying those are good options. They're not good. Right. But you can just see it, like you can start to see it play out that way, right? Like that's conditioning. Yeah. No, it's a great point. It's an important point. Like Trump would be your classic, it's like archetypal example of brutalization that he's then passing off to others. And the third option, which is really the only viable one, is to transform it in ourselves and in our groups, and then make of it life. You know, make creativity out of it, which again doesn't retroactively. We don't have to get into a big spiritual narrative that it justifies it or whatever. Just to say like. And that's a hard one, especially when it comes down to a person, again, like a classic example of someone who's totally innocent and is really, you know, deeply victimized. It's hard to say, but it's really important to say they're not to blame for what's happened to them, but we're all responsible for how we deal with the effects. And it's not okay to just play hot potato with our trauma. Like, oh, here you go. You take it. No, you take it. Then we're just all passing around and that's true. Again, that's true from any level of trauma, like high strange trauma, people who have really anomalous, out of the blue, seemingly out of nowhere experiences that just really rip the veils temporarily down and they see something that they are not ready to see. And now they've been initiated, whether they like it or not, whether they chose it or not. And now they're left with the responsibility to deal with the impacts of something that they don't feel like they actually signed up for or wanted to participate in. And initiations can be really rough. And, traditional societies are pretty open about the fact that if you fail an initiation, it's bad. You know, people who get initiated but don't get through to the other side of transformation end up in this kind of like zombie, Walking Dead, undead thing where they're kind of like their old life is gone, but there's not a new life, and they're in this weird haunted space that's kind of no space, and that's a brutal place to be.
Half shamans and broken shamans.
It's a tough spot.
Shamanism is interesting in this regard to me, not only because there's a rich history of the shamans seeking out boundary transgressing experiences, psychedelic or ritual ordeal, or even just spending all night in the ash of the graveyard. Right. But there's a political welcoming of those people to some degree in the mass mind of the society, right? The guy comes back covered with ash and you think, holy shit, maybe he's got something to tell us. Right? And that runs right up to the contemporary time. One of the things that always stood out to me about American presidents is they're really weird, right? Yeah. They're not at all like the parody of American presidents on TV shows. They, to elect Reagan, that guy from the cowboy movies, okay, right? And then,
whose wife had
yeah,
astrologers and married Todd Lincoln's doing seances in the White House, totally.
Right, and then all of a sudden, when I was a kid, I saw Bill Clinton playing the saxophone on TV, and a couple years later, he was debating what the meaning of the word "is" was. And then George Bush was really strange. And then to just get an Obama was odd. But now Trump is so odd that it's a running gag, that it's just too strange to even keep up with. But the people oddly have embraced this. So is there a strangeness that people exude that says, I've been in touch with the weird, and therefore you can trust me to steer the ship, because we might need to know how to deal with what we can't understand?
Yeah, well, I would say being in touch with the weird is one thing. Having actually transformed and have coherency and regulation is another. So shamans are supposed to be able to go across the worlds, find some important, whether they go to the lower world or they go to the upper world, they're supposed to find some things and they're supposed to bring them back for practical purposes. Hunting grounds, medicine, dreaming and insight for what's best for everybody. But lots of people go over to those other worlds and just become themselves idiosyncratic and brutalized, frankly, and they become traumatized. And they can just as easily transmit partial luminosity or partial realization mixed with a whole bunch of other weird kind of pollutants in there. And so I think humility is really important. When people start getting on their high horses about they're the final prophet, and they're the world teacher, and then I think bells should start going off of versus the person who says, look, I've had contact with other forces. Here's what I've sought to learn. Here's the stuff that's still unclear to me. Here's where I kind of see my limits of understanding. That, I think, to me is a much more sane proposition.
Well, that sounds ideal, but
sure.
Not necessarily what people are voting for.
No, well, yeah, on a political side, I was thinking more just in terms of, politics, good God, I wouldn't have an answer on that one. I meant more just kind of medicine type people, or, sure, how to start to discern as best as any of us can as human beings, people who are more aligned and trustworthy, and we're all human. So
that sounds like a really good, like a shout out for higher level incorporation of this stuff, right? As far as I'm concerned, it's really hard to trust somebody with these things unless they're open and humorous and vulnerable and sensitive and human and complex, and right, that gives them an authentic reliability. But that's because I'm at the looking for authentic reliability level,
Sure. You're not just looking for a charismatic overlord who's going to tell you all the things that are how to live your life. And
that's right. But if I was looking for a charismatic overlord, sure, I would want him to have one foot in the other world. I would want him to be something I can't quite process in the way that I can't quite symbolize the Lacanian real. Right? I want him to not just be somebody who says, hey, I'm the perfectly enlightened avatar. I want them to show me something where I'm like, holy shit, this is currently are not fitting into my model of reality. You're not just telling me about it.
Yeah. It's certainly true that the more that there is immersion, the more there's the possibility to transmit. I think this is where our meaning-making structures are really important, because increasingly, as the veils are thinning, more and more people are getting dunked into the deep end. But we have a kind of cultural pattern, especially in North America, I'd say, of experience gives one automatic authority in a matter. And really, that's just a lot of opinions. And so it's hard, because especially when it comes to high strange, people believe their stories, and we should be extremely suspicious, open, questioning, and critical of our attempts to rationalize and narratively encapsulate that which is by nature very trickstery, ephemeral, malleable. Which isn't to say we shouldn't do it. I think it is part of it, but to have a kind of self-reflective awareness to be like, this is my kind of current version of how I'm trying to map and make sense of this otherwise, like you said, highly ambivalent world. And when people believe too quickly their own versions of what they think that all is, then I start to get that twigs for me.
Yeah, when I was a kid, Robert Anton Wilson and Philip K. Dick were like exemplary figures for me of guys who encountered high weirdness, and yet they just periodically came up with new interpretations. I thought it might be this. Now I think maybe it's this. I also thought it might have been this. Just that ongoing digestion process was really admirable to me when I read that stuff.
Yeah, it's really good artistry. And, you know, Wilson's a great example in the sense that I think, I mean, why are we talking about all this high strangeness? One, because the world is increasingly becoming bizarre by the day. But I think somehow or other, that world is key to us evolving. And that's more or less kind of Wilson's argument. However, like we do learn that we're going to have to learn how to channel and constructively co-create, I think, with whatever we want to call that, the ethers, the other world, the subtle, because I think our attempts to kind of rationally control and micromanage existence through materialism and technocracy and all the rest have led us down a complete blind alley and really led us into disaster. So the obverse of that isn't obviously like automatically now we're connected to high strangeness, now we got all the answers. Like it gets even more complicated, it gets even more tricky, but I do think that's the only way forward.
So I would agree that it seems like the world is getting stranger. But one argument is it's a blip and it'll renormalize. Mm-hmm. The other argument is the Terence McKenna argument that the entire arc of time and history moves toward weirdness.
Right.
And that explains its acceleration. What do you think? Is there a back to normal, or is there only a forward into ever more strange?
I think the strange has always been there. I think it's us humans who have tried to, over certain arcs of history, over certain cycles, have tried to flatten out or iron out that weirdness. And I think that has led to a bunch of unconscious, and in the worst case, kind of eccentric weirdness. Like a kind of graphic example I can think of is, I remember when I went to Auschwitz, and I went up in the observation deck. You can go and then kind of look out at the whole complex. And the thing that struck me as the truly, in some ways, most horrifying element of the whole thing was how perfectly built the whole thing was. Like all these like cobblestone roads and all the like, you know, things are in perfect linear order and they're all spaced like it's a street. And I just had to think like, so somebody like some architect guy is like laying this thing out. Okay, we're going to build all these like places to house people. Here's where we're going to kill everybody. Here's where we're going to dump all the bodies. And they just like, but we better build it like, you know, we need to be logical here, right? Better rational in terms of how we build this thing. And nobody ever thought, hey, maybe the illogical or the irrational element of this whole thing is that we're building this whole thing to like just murder people, right? Maybe this whole slave thing is a bad idea. And the real rationality would be to question the whole existence of the undertaking. No, we've created all these like extremely logical, ordered, rational principles to try to control things that are based, to me, in a deep irrationality. And I think that's made a weirdness that's like an inverse. I think the weirdness of life is like nature spirits and animism, and I think that's weird. But I think that's kind of like the regular weird or the ontological weird. Whereas I think we humans have created this kind of nightmarish anti-dream that has its own weirdness because we've spent all this time trying to repress the wildness and the weirdness of life. It's ended up coming back around in a really unconscious, shadowy, destructive form.
So you're at Auschwitz and you're experiencing weirdness downstream from the architectural event in which those people did not experience the weirdness. So it's been outsourced to you. Now, it seems like what they didn't do was to connect different aspects of their own nature, different perspectives, right? They were working on one part, but they weren't working on another part, which they might be capable of doing, but they weren't allowing those things to interface with each other to cause any productive friction. They weren't, they were disallowing cognitive dissonance and refusing interperspectival weirdness.
Yeah.
So
and
what's
empathy.
the connection between the interperspectival and the ordinary ontological weirdness of nature?
Oh, great question. I don't get asked that question every day. To link it back to the earlier discussion around sort of stress or trauma or survival instincts, when the survival instincts are in high, are running the, kind of running the ship there, piloting our being, when they're really locked in, they're not, our empathy and our perspectival taking is turned off, just even from a biological standpoint. Different aspects of the brain that are extremely instinctual or archaic, we might even say, take over, and the aspects that have natural degrees of empathy, natural degrees of taking in space for the other, thinking of the other, those shut down. And then at that point, people start to look out on the world and other people as objects, not as beings of sentience. And then once people are objects, or once nature is an object for that matter, then, it's the Lorax at that point. It's just, resource to be harvested. There's no, survival instincts are very short term. Again, they're supposed to be short term emergency measures. When they become the chronic default setting, the ability to think longer term, the ability to think of others, all starts to get really damaged. And we end up doing things that are seemingly in the short term of benefit, in the long term will be very destructive. For example, I might argue that shutting down the whole world, one could argue that shutting down everything in the world is a reactive panic response out of a survival instinct, has a certain short-term possibility. My concern is that we'll put in emergency protocols in terms of civil rights, governmental policies that will not get turned off, right? So when we have trauma and then it's not resolved, you end up with chronic survival instincts, which in the long term are really destructive and poisonous. And my concern is that we'll have basically this kind of mass sort of pandemic trauma event, and then we're going to end up with a series of trauma responses that over the long haul is going to actually be worse than the disease itself. That would be my fear.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me this could go in one of three ways down the line. Either you get an exacerbation of authoritarian populism, or you get an empowerment of progressive populism, or you get a more locked down return to normal, which is also the normal that caused the problem.
Precisely.
And that may well depend on how healthy, resilient, open, tantric, able to handle traumatic moods that we're in. I mean, Reich's argument in the 20s and 30s, his argument, like, why didn't it go into progressive populism? Why did Germany go into authoritarian reactionism? Was the emotions, the bodies, the sexuality, the ability to comport yourself with energy and stimulation was missing in the people, in their bodies, in their families, and as a result, didn't matter what their socioeconomic position was. They did absolutely the wrong thing for themselves because they weren't able to handle the influx of energy and peculiarity.
I think there's a lot to that, actually. And I think there's a lot to be said of parallels or comparisons to the present moment, to what he was, analyzing in his time.
There's something in my mind about trance and shamanism and surrealism and what I might call half consciousness, right? Like in surrealism, you're balancing the conscious and the unconscious mind. You're getting those half and half things. And shamanic trance is a little bit like that too, and hypnosis as well. You're not quite switched totally from the conscious to the unconscious. You're more in like a 50-50 mode, which might even be our ancient normal mode. There's something in there where that's our learning mode, where we might be optimally able to assimilate new patterns and therefore able to position ourselves to not be traumatized as much. But also there may be a mentality there where we activate parts of our intelligence that can handle stranger situations in a way that the foreground of consciousness can't handle it. What do you make of that?
Pro. No, I think you're. Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, the most of high strange experiences, a lot, let's say, often happen in that liminal hypnagogic twilight state. The UFO stories tend to mostly play in that, like they're just falling asleep. They're not all the way into a deep dreaming scenario. They're just kind of falling asleep, and then some strangeness happens. I think the ability to learn to regulate ourselves in the waking state can then transfer to other states. So to me, these kind of practices are important on their own terms, but it's not like they shut off or we can't carry them through, whether one is astral traveling or lucid dreaming or in a plant medicine ritualistic encounter. So I'm not a plant medicine guy, but because I always say my system's already at 11. So I don't want to crank it. I might not come back, but I've definitely worked with a lot of people where we've actually practiced energy hygiene and regulation processes, which they then take with them into ceremonial encounters. And it's remarkably different than if they're just kind of assuming that whoever the ayahuasqueros or the shamans or whoever are just taking care of the whole thing, and I just kind of lay back and Mother Ayahuasca just doesn't work for me and stuff. It's like, well, actually you can participate in this in a way that's not controlling. It's not trying to white knuckle and master this thing, but it is navigating and like a sort of co-agency. And I think that's what's really missing in most of the narratives around the high strange. I think there's way too much passivity. I think there's way too much energy spent about trying to figure out what it is. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it weird? And we can never figure it out. And not enough time and energy spent on what is our ethics and what's our empowerment and what's our accountability of what we bring to the table, which I would say like traditional shamanism spent a lot more time putting emphasis on that.
So here's the thing traditional shamanism did. It ritually shocked the hell out of people in various ways. Now, when you were talking earlier about fight, flight, and freeze, those are classic sympathetic nervous system responses. And so one way to look at that would be you got to relax those, bring them down, get into a more sattvic, equanimity, calmness state. Shift to the parasympathetic nervous system. But another way of looking at that is that we aren't good with our sympathetic nervous system, right? Maybe we have allergies because our immune system doesn't have enough things to fight. Maybe we're vulnerable to disease because we don't take enough hits, physically, emotionally, psychologically. They'd have to be the right kind of hits. But what do you make of theories that if we were partially hit more often with something that exceeds what we can handle, then we would be more robust in the face of these challenges when they come at us from the outside?
Yeah, if they're consciously transformed, you know, that's always kind of my response. Like, if we can transmute it, then I think there is actually what they call in kind of alternative physics over unity. Like, more energy starts showing up
Right.
than was input. If not, if the transmutation or the initiation isn't finished or complete or assimilated, it can just be more, just taking more hits. Like, then we have this kind of counter-responsive cultural pattern of like, well, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. Well, you know, I could get my arm lopped off, I might not die, but it definitely didn't make me stronger. So that doesn't make any sense. I do think the ability to consciously learn to work with our nervous system is one of the most important things all of us can be working on. Because,
yep.
Yeah, I just think because it's one thing we actually have a degree of agency and again, not control like control, but choice, capacity. And I think, go ahead.
Traumatic growth, or what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, seems to apply under a particular set of constraints. And one of the major constraints, I think, what you were pointing to is it's voluntary. You have to be able to regulate your exposure, which seems to be the heart of things like exposure therapy. People are trying to deal with phobias and stuff like that. Right. That it would be re-traumatizing if they had no control, but it's de-traumatizing if they can regulate or at least activate the intentional systems of their brain at each step in the process, which is also, I mean, I've been doing these cold shower things.
Right.
Wim Hof style, got to protect yourself against COVID. But, you know, I couldn't do 5 seconds at the beginning. Now I'm up to 5 minutes. It's pretty good. But it only worked for me because I was completely in control of how much I was taking. I was going to my edge, but nothing was making me go past my edge before I was ready. So then it became over unity. I'm getting more out of that experience than I'm putting in now. But it could easily go the other way if I had no control.
And that's the core principle of titration. That's the heart of it, is the ability to just find the edge and just do a little bit and just get comfortable with just a little bit more than you're currently comfortable with, and then back the hell off, integrate that, go run around, have some fun, enjoy some liberated energy. Next time, you know, the ball has moved 2 yards down the line. And the problem with that, I mean, that's the way that it's supposed to work. The problem comes in is like what you're describing about 5 seconds to 5 minutes, and the path you've taken to move it like that is really, it's really important, because everybody else wants my 3 steps and my weekend to my completely transformed life that will be forever, you know, all the 70s stuff with encounter groups where people are being like shocked into like catatonic states. Essentially, they just go into freeze because they get overloaded, you know, the whole like est or something where like they couldn't get up to go to the bathroom and they locked the door, and all this like crazy abusive like kind of stuff that was going on under the guise of like, you got to get the feelings out. You know, the repression was so deep in that era that they worked so hard to try to break the repression, to let things loose, but it often just broke people. And we have to be so much more intelligent about like, okay, that much, this much, this much. And that goes against the grain of cultural conditioning to get the fast, cheap, you know, success story. But it actually is the way that we really build true resilience and strength in our being.
First of all, the ad for this is going to be a picture of you like this, and it's going to say, Chris Dierkes explains how to introduce people to sodomy.
It's going to be like little Dicky.
Yeah,
I'm going to be little Dicky. I'm going to have the little Dicky. It was
Second of all, what I liked about that is the sense of, same as when I was talking about shamanic and surrealistic consciousness, there's a kind of halfway, right? Yeah. There's a collaborative move with the UFO or the psychedelic experience and the rupture, something like this, because when we encounter a boundary condition, we tend to withdraw from it or think we can smash through it or leap past it automatically to the other side. And both of those are ways of neglecting the experience of the boundary itself.
It's a great point. It's really true. And it's a real art to learn to cultivate that disposition in ourselves so that we can be okay with that intermediate space. Like you said, not immediately retract, nor immediately try to like destroy and push through, but actually just go like, wow, that's really, and to start using different words. I often work with people just to stop using the word pain. Pain's too broad. It's not telling me anything. Is it tearing? Is it ripping? Is it aching? Is it numb? Is it like, these are, you can get so much more specificity than just these kind of generic-y terms that we throw around about good or bad or positive or negative, or I like it or I don't like it, and really start to become curious about a wider range of experience and still feel safe in that. That's the key.
Curiosity seems like one of those more intact experiences that you need to have as the preliminary for going into these things. What you're saying there reminded me of Lacan again, because languaging is one of the ways that you turn the traumatic kernel of the real into something symbolic, something that's integratable. But there's also this, it reminds me of Eugene Genlin and focusing, if you're familiar with that. There's other parts of you know things, but they don't necessarily have the words. And you need them on side to go through this stuff. And so you might need to not only figure out alternative phraseology from the thesaurus, but find the word that's right for the moment that clicks in with the tacit sense that you have of what's going on for you.
It's a really important point, and I think the folks that you mentioned Philip K. Dick and Colin Wilson. In the kind of UFO world, I was thinking of people like Whitley Strieber, or I mentioned when we did the roundtable interview, a guy named Mike Cleland. And to me, like, one of the hallmarks of the wiser versions of people reflecting on their experience is when there is a lot of like haunting, eerie, beautiful, numinous degrees, I suppose, of ambiguity or ambivalence, but also like to hear resilience, to hear a person, not that they've gotten through it, but that they've come through the alchemy changed, versus I see a lot of experiencer types where they're just transmitting unfinished experience. And then their interpretation and their sense of self tends to get fused. And then if one is critical, I get in trouble sometimes because I might criticize some of the interpretation or open questions about it. And then it feels like it's a personal attack when it's not. Again, experience doesn't, in my mind, give us automatic authority. To me, a transformed person transmits authority. And it really have to learn to discern the qualities that come through, like the classic example of the 12-step group, and the person who's actually like gone through addiction still has their temptations, but has come to a more coherent place in their life. Like, they just carry an authority that's self-authenticating, like they're the real deal, versus people who are trying to talk themselves into it or inspire or talk a good game or whatever. Like, there's other people, they just talk and people listen because they know that person's been through the shit and has come out the other side. And somebody else can be an expert and say, well, you should do this and you should do that. But if they don't have not struggled with an addiction issue, people are going to turn them off because who the hell are they? But the person who has the personal experience, plus they've come through the fire kind of in a place of resolution, to me, those are the people that I try to listen to.
I definitely want to listen to people who can digest food and not just have it in their mouth.
Exactly.
But here's what worries me still. I might feel like they have something real, but they might talk about something else, and I might mistake the one quality for expertise in the other area.
Great point. It's the discernment is always it's a moving target, and it's always in play. Yeah.
Now, earlier you were talking like in a very kind of classic way that we may have left behind this enchanted universe, and now we're in the material, or that we're neglecting the realm of the other, and treating people as objects, or getting lost in the realm of objects generally. Now, there's a lot of truth to that, but there's something I always want to unpack from that, which is, seems to me an object can also be an other, right? Could be intensely strange. And, it's not simply that organisms and persons are turned into objects. It's that objects themselves could be wondrously strange, as could other people, as could the othering of ourselves. Each one of these quadrants, or wherever we want to call it, has this option. And it's not that we are stuck in the upper right zone and have to get down into the mutual interaction zone. It's that every zone is either sort of stuck or sort of opening up into the strangeness. And there's artists who bring that forward really well. Some of the Zen stuff, I think the way H.P. Lovecraft writes, his constant excessive attempt to describe things as being more than they could possibly be, it was indescribable, right? Or the way David Lynch directs, when you're just like, here's a room, here's the light switch, oh my God, you're that crackling noise, look at the light switch, right? You're like, it's bizarre, there's strangeness and there's too muchness in the thing. It's like it's being othered. How do you feel about that?
Pro. No, I really appreciate you saying that. Like, I really, it's an extremely important point. Yeah, I think, again, I think it's whatever it is, maybe it's some mechanism of the mental rational structure of consciousness, or the neocortex, or I don't know, cultural patterning, all of the above. It's a lot of imprinting to try to make that weirdness go away. And I think what we're talking about here in terms of regulation and digestion is really important to offer a kind of healthy middle path, or healthy as it can be, I suppose. Because I think people think either we have this kind of control systems, we have regularity, we have linearity, rationality, these systems we're used to, or it's just going to be total chaos, and it's going to be some weird art house thing where it's just weird distortion and disorientation. And there's no meaning.
Andy Warhol future.
Right. It's just all going to like melting off the wall and stuff. And I think there is a third way that's about coherence and regulation, but it's still a wild ride. It's still super weird. It's still highly anomalous and strange. But it's much more about learning to navigate the rapids while in them, rather than having a bunch of arguments necessarily about the nature of rapids. Right? It's like, well, we're kind of in the boat. We're on the rapids now. We might as well get paddling here and know how to be agile. Because
it seems like there's different methodological zones of inquiry relative to the same process, right? We're looking at some kind of balance, some kind of half and half, a yin-yang thing that enables flow between reality that's comprehensible and reality that we can't get a grip on, even though we have to work with it.
Right.
Now, part of that is just living. You're thrown in and you have to swim. You figure out how to make love by being in the situation where you try to do it. On the other hand, we also have to build systems and machines and computer architecture that does the same thing. And for that, we need a hell of a lot of intellectual arguments about what comprises these things, where their boundaries are, how they operate. I've been really interested in computational complexity and the idea that most of the possible computational patterns in existence are like the digits of pi. They go to an incalculable place. There's only a very small number of possible patterns that are actually linearly comprehensible and able to be shortcutted by algebraic formulations. Most of the system goes beyond what we can process, and we have to deal with that. But we can build machines that run those for us, and we can have push button novelty, essentially, right? You could have a new song, a new car pressed out every day, and it would never be like another one that had ever been made ever. That's really intriguing to me. That reminds, I mentioned McKenna earlier. People think that McKenna was just saying that novelty is going to go to infinity over time. But I think what he's saying is habit and novelty are going to converge to infinity. Right? There's an infinite inability to tell what's regular and what's irregular coming, that what's predictable and unpredictable, if you use a McKenna style model, which is pretty out there to use. But I'm interested in the idea that in some zones we really have to think through what normal and abnormal mean. In other zones we just have to live it. There's all these different.
It's really. Yeah, it relates with that McKenna. Your point about McKenna is really good. It's a really lucid articulation. Maybe more lucid than he is on occasion, depending on which texture. Yeah. But no, I think it's I think the framework of this conversation, the trauma and regulation and coherency is certainly, I think, a foundational element. I wouldn't ever say it's the final element, but I do think it's a kind of sine qua non or something. It's some necessary but not sufficient condition. And I'd even take that into technology and things, but I'd have to think about that more, how that would work. But
I've been watching this Tiger King series on Netflix.
Oh, yeah.
And it's fantastic. It's what I want from a documentary, which is you can never side with anybody.
Right.
Like that great one about Rajneesh from last year.
Right,
but,
totally.
I'm watching it and I'm connecting it to everything that's going on culturally. A couple episodes in, I'm really good. I'm thrilled. I think, finally, this is what I want from TV. But last night, it was too much. I had to turn it off. It was just one insane thing after another, and I'm good at this. I had to shut it down, I'm like, I don't want to be shaking on the couch. It was too much strangeness too fast, and I'm like, I was getting near my own limit.
It's good titration.
What I want to know from you is, when's the last time you were close to your strangeness limit?
Oh, good question. Just timing-wise, it's probably, I got about 5 minutes or so. So it's probably.
Yeah, sure. We'll end on a personal note.
We'll end on a personal note. Gosh, when was the last time I was out over my skis? It's interesting. I mean, my mind immediately goes to a series of events because I was this, some of that we buddies for a while. Like I was this kind of heavy duty spiritual seeker guy in my 20s and went full cosmonaut and went full like enlightenment or bust, and mostly bust. It was mostly a bust, but there were a few nuggets in there. But all this emphasis now on titration and modulation and finding our edges and growing capacity is because that's exactly the opposite of what I did for all those years and suffered the effects of it. And I genuinely don't want other people to have to go through that kind of horror. Now, as I say that, though, then another part of my brain is like, well, that's a nice narrative that I've created in my brain, that it's like, it was back then. So it's really interesting. This is like you're pushing into a place where it's, I'll say this, since the UFO subject, has been kind of which is only one dimension of a much larger, obviously, strangeness. I will still feel myself reading like a Whitney Strieber at night in bed. And he's talking about, here's some ways to start to connect and reach out. And I've had encounters with all manner of what people would probably consider to be entities or presences or forces. And even I find myself get like an immediate, like, and he says it in the text, he's very open about it. You know, he says like, they're really weird, they're scary looking. Like that's kind of his basic, just not a very primal human thing. Like people freak out because of big bug eyes and like whatever is going on there. And I keep finding myself edging up towards like, am I gonna like do some of that close encounter of the fifth kind stuff? Am I gonna start actually like inviting a entity or whatever? Because I hang out with angels. You know, people come in, their grandmother's spirits show up or whatever, however we understand that. I've been in the woods and felt what I would consider to be like the nature spirits and, you know, all kinds of stuff like that. But that all fit kind of safe within my Catholic and later quasi-shamanic-y kind of thing. Like, even for me, this one is still... I mean, I can read those channeled texts from the Arcturians. That feels pretty safe, right? They're these light star beings. Like, that's cool. I can, but the classic gray, whatever insect type thing, like I still have this like
right on the edge. You might accidentally start invoking them, and then that would be it.
Then it gets very Lovecraft. Then it's Lovecraftian, and I got kids, and I gotta keep it together. So I like. Yeah, so maybe
reminds me of, speaking of kids, like if you watch, you know, Candyman, or there's episodes or shows like Supernatural, and when they see somebody who's going to say the words 3 times in the mirror, kids freak out. They're like, no, don't say it.
Yeah, totally.
That seemed like I might accidentally bring the impossible into being.
Well, Strieber is a great example of that because his, you know, he was first a horror writer, right? You know, he wrote on vampires and werewolves and stuff, and he writes in his first classic UFO book. You know, he actually thought maybe he, in some Lovecraftian style dynamic, had basically ripped open some vortex in the space-time continuum by his books, and that these entities were now preying upon him or like haunting him in some nightmarish thing because he brought him into being through his, like, he genuinely thought that for a little bit, you know. So I can see why people, to be able to regulate the panic flight mechanism, to bring it back to that, is intense, especially if it goes full blaring. Like, it's intense.
Combine that, the need to be able to regulate your neurophysiology, and at the same time, the intellectual capacity to not just get trapped in one of your interpretations, which is always a risk.
Totally. Yeah.